Good morning, everyone. It looks like we've got some people joining, so I'll start out with some overview thoughts. First of all, welcome and good morning. Thank you for joining our session this morning. I know there's lots of great sessions on the calendar for the conference at this time, and indeed all day yesterday and today. So thanks to the state staff who've done a tremendous job in putting this conference together. I certainly already learned a lot from yesterday's session.
If we're ready, just so that we keep on timeline, let's get started. I'll do some introductions for everyone just to make sure we're all aware. It is up on the screen, but this is how can homeless systems help fill the housing need. And our moderator today is Michelle Flynn. She's the executive director of the Road Home in Salt Lake City, Utah, and has worked in homeless services and developed housing-focused programs for more than 20 years. We have Katie Miller joining us. She's the regional coordinator for the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. Katie Miller is on the national initiatives team at the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. She works in the Western United States and communities to implement best practice solutions to prevent and end homelessness. We have Janice Olson with us. She's the director of housing programs, or deputy director, excuse me, of housing programs at the Road Home. Janice Olson currently serves, she's worked there for 12 years and is an LCSW and has also completed a master's in international relations from the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. And we have Carol Holloway with us. She's the CEO of Switchpoint. Carol's lived in Utah since 2019. She has 4 grown boys and is expecting her first grandson at any minute. Carol started Switchpoint in 2014 with the collaboration with the City of St. George. There are full bios on our presenters and moderator available on the website. We're just keeping them short so we have more time to kind of go over everything we want to discuss.
All right, thank you so much for those introductions. I'm going to start out by just making a few comments. I'm really excited to hear from the 3 panelists and this session particularly. We know that affordable housing really is the backbone that we need to reduce and end homelessness. And sometimes as homeless service providers and those doing this work, we need to think about what our role is out in the affordable housing field. And I think of a couple of things I want to lead with. One is advocacy. I know yesterday we had a great session with former Senate President Niederhauser and Senator Escamilla and Representative Elison. We have information that those policymakers need, and it's really important that we are at the table and sharing that information because we know that we need their help to create the kind of affordable housing, the quantity and types of affordable housing that we need across the state of Utah. The second is best practices. We know that we need to listen to and pay attention to research and data to guide our work and utilize those best practices that we know will actually reduce the number of people experiencing homelessness. Some examples of that in other sessions are permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing, but there are many other examples as well. And the third thing I was thinking about was the importance of listening to our guests and people who are experiencing homelessness about what they're saying about what they want and what kind of help they want from us, what kind of housing is going to work for them, and think about what those gaps are in the community. So there are many, many different kinds of housing that we need because people and families and households are unique. And so we're excited that we have some new creative housing developments and housing programs happening in Salt Lake County and across the state. We're going to turn this over, spend about a half an hour with our 3 panelists. You heard their introductions. I'll just add a couple things and say, we're so happy to have Katie Miller here from USICH. She's a brilliant and strategic thinker with just a deep knowledge of best practices and outcomes and is our representative for the state of Utah, as well as a number of other states here in the West. And Janice brings just such a depth of knowledge and experience in both housing and behavioral health. And I'm excited for you to hear from her about some great programming that we've been working on the last couple of years at the Road Home. And then we're so pleased to have Carol and Switchpoint working in Salt Lake County now, bringing in her background. And again, like with the road home, starting with listening to the people who we're serving, who are experiencing homelessness, and then moving forward to create the types of housing that you're hearing that they need. So, well, glad to have you as well, Carol. And we'll just get started and turn it over to Katie.
Great, thanks, Michelle. It's great to be with you all today. Just wanted to start with a little bit of an introduction of what USICH is, what we do. USICH is a very small federal agency, but our job is to coordinate the federal response to homelessness across 19 federal agencies at the cabinet level. We work in partnership also at the local, state, and bridge what's happening at the federal level with policy. And foremost, I want to put out there that USICH believes that housing should be a right and not a privilege. Next slide. There are some key things to think about as we talk about creating housing solutions. We have a huge opportunity right now, and I'll go into some of the funding that's available, but we have a once in a generation opportunity with new federal funding that has come out that is specifically targeting people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness through the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan. And so we say it's really important to fully leverage all of these new federal funding resources for homelessness and affordable housing. It's really important also to make sure your system is moving so that there's low barrier shelter for people to come inside to safety, and then there's adequate permanent housing for people to exit to. And we especially need a strategy around unsheltered homelessness. It's also really important to ensure that affordable housing resources are targeted to those who are most vulnerable. Sometimes we hear communities talk about affordable housing, but it's really not for the folks that we serve in the homeless system. There has to be very low rents and housing that's targeted to people with the lowest income levels. Otherwise, we are not going to be able to move people out of homelessness. They're not going to be able to move on and gain that success. Next slide. It's also really important, and I think that what I'm excited about for this session is to talk about the range of housing models. We really can't think about one particular opportunity. It has to be all of the different ways that we can leverage housing and create housing for people who are experiencing homelessness. It's really important for a community to assess the needs and also ensure that we have a range of options for people based on their unique characteristics and their unique household needs. We also need to ensure that racial equity is at the center of our planning and our outreach efforts to both prevention and homelessness. As Michelle mentioned, we need to talk and we need to hear directly from the people that are in our programs and in our systems to ensure that we have their voices and we know what they're facing and what challenges we can help them get through. We also need to work across housing and health systems. We learned this more than anything during the pandemic, that when our health and our housing systems align and work together, we can move with urgency. There is also a significant amount of money dedicated to addressing healthcare needs through the bill that's going through Congress right now. Potentially, there's a significant amount of resource around Medicaid. Those resources can be aligned with housing and again, help support those households who have much more service needs. Also, we need to use local data to drive policy and investments. We can't just assume we know exactly what models we need to target or what investments we need to make. We have to use our data to inform that policy and inform what our gaps are and then where we need to go as a community. Next slide. This next slide outlines some of the funding. As I mentioned, huge amounts of resources that we have to take I just got muted. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, sorry about that, Carol, or Katie.
No worries, no worries. So we have a lot of money through these resources, and I don't need to read them all out to you. I know that it's difficult for communities to understand all the different lines of funding that are coming out and figure out how to put these together. We can help with that. I know the other piece of this is that the funding is coming out in different ways. It's not through typical agencies that receive continuum of care funding, or it may be through the home grant. So it's really important for these partnerships right now that everyone work together with the housing authorities and with all of the agencies where this money is coming through, so that we can make sure that we're maximizing the resource. Next slide. This goes through some of the funding with the American Rescue Plan. As mentioned in the bottom line, the support for schools, this is very exciting for homeless children and youth. Again, really important to work across systems to ensure that we're working with not just our usual friends in the homeless system, but we're working with education, we're working with healthcare, and we're making sure that we're accessing and leveraging all of these resources. Next slide. And then this was just, this is the regular 2021 appropriations, and goes through that funding as well. And the 2.7 billion from the continuum of care, family unification vouchers, new housing choice vouchers. So all of these, again, need to be part of the picture that we think about as we address homelessness. And if we don't take advantage of all of these resources, we're missing a huge opportunity. And it's very hard at the federal level for us to continue to go back to Congress and say we need more money to address homelessness if we're not fully utilizing all of these resources that are available to us. So again, partnerships are key. Working across systems and aligning efforts and using data to drive our work is really going to be how we get there. So thank you so much. Oh, just also to mention the resources through the FEMA funds, the public assistance category B, that was the non-congregate shelter, which is 100% reimbursable. Through the end of the year, this has been a huge opportunity for communities. Just to say 1 minute, what we learned from housing people in non-congregate shelter during the pandemic is that folks who had been unsheltered for many years and had not engaged in services engaged in a way that we had never seen before. And it offered them a place to come inside and have safety and rest. And we saw some incredible transformations. And so when communities are able to test and use this model of non-congregate shelter, I really recommend it. When we house people in very large congregate settings, it's very hard for them to stabilize. And what we found is that in non-congregate settings, people were able to do it much faster. And so this is an opportunity we hope that people have taken advantage of, will take advantage of. Many states and communities are now buying these hotels that they used during the pandemic, where now they're turning these hotels into permanent housing. And this is, again, a great opportunity to not have to build housing from scratch, but to be able to, again, move quickly, think outside the box about opportunities to create housing fast. And then also the CDC eviction moratorium, which helped a lot of people from falling into homelessness. As we look at our data, and how many people we move into housing every year. We move record numbers of people into permanent housing, but we see a very large number of people coming into housing, and we're very anxious about that. We have to stop the flow of people entering homelessness, as well as working with urgency to help people move to permanent housing. Thank you. This is just a slide to tell you that USICH is in the midst of updating our new federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness. We are being charged by our chair, who is Secretary Fudge from HUD, to create a new federal plan, and that plan will be coming out in May. We would like input from everyone. And so this link is on our web page where you can give us your feedback directly into the web page. And so please take the time to do that. We're interested in hearing from you. And again, this is our website. So thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Katie. And thanks for that last comment about non-congregate shelter. We did learn a lot. And one of the things we learned is that folks who shared hotel rooms actually ended up being good fits for long-term roommates. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. So my presentation today is all about something that is completely normal. It's something that I imagine most of us in this session have done at some point in our lives, but it is for some reason a newer concept for folks who have been homeless, for especially a newer concept for service providers to think about and to implement. So for just for the sake of a quick definition, shared housing, the way we're defining it in this sector is two or more unrelated people who are living in the same house. That can look a number of different ways, but some common scenarios are that a landlord will rent out an entire house or a unit to a group of people who are choosing to live together. Somebody who owns a home might choose to rent out a room or a portion of the house to somebody that's unrelated to them. Or what Katie just talked about was looking at a renovation of perhaps a hotel or new purpose-built construction. I think many of us remember several years ago when we had SROs, we had them in Salt Lake City at least, where it was just a bedroom and perhaps a shared bathroom and kitchen and living space. Next slide. So as we talk about shared housing, there is now a framework in which we talk about it, and there are some basic tenets of shared housing. So I'll just run through those really quickly. The first is around messaging to the people that we're serving. So we have worked really hard at the Road Home to ensure that all of our staff are having conversations about shared housing when we talk about housing options moving on from shelter. We talk a lot about client choice, so making sure that this is presented as one of many options, not the only option, and that when we're thinking about roommates, we're very, very thoughtful in how we help match people with the right one or two people that they want to be living with. We have a very specific approach to landlord engagement. We want to make sure that our landlords understand the benefits of shared housing, and also that we're there as service providers to help problem solve when any conflict arises. And we're also having good conversations about individual leases, especially when we're leasing folks up. We do have some methods for roommate matching, and we'll talk more about those in a minute. Primarily, and what's great to see is when people are matching on their own and naturally, but when that doesn't happen, we have some tools that we can use to help folks think about whether or not the person that they're choosing is a good match for them. And then we focus a lot on conflict mediation. We want to make sure that not only our tenants, but our staff are equipped to know that conflict is normal and natural, but also that they have the skills and resources that they need to resolve that conflict when it comes up. Next slide, Michelle. I probably don't need to talk about this too much, but it's important enough that I have a couple of slides on it. We all know, at least in Salt Lake County, that rents have increased dramatically in the last several years. There's plenty more headlines that I could have drawn from the internet for this slide. But it is, the prices have absolutely skyrocketed. I looked at a condo near my house downtown a few weeks back, and for a 2-bed, it was running at $2,700. It was a bit of a luxury condo, but the square footage was quite small. And I was pretty shocked by that price, but that's where we're headed. Next slide. So in Utah, we have around 290,000 renters, and of those renters, about 22% are what are considered extremely low income. So what that means in dollar amount is that in 2021, the household to be considered extremely low income, a 4-person household can't make more than $25,800. But what that household actually needs in today's market to make housing affordable is $41,251. And you can see in orange there, the number of units that we are short, the affordable units that we need in Salt Lake County to meet the demand. We're very far behind in terms of developing affordable housing, which we all are aware of. Of the 22%, 71% are severely cost burdened in their rent. And generally what that means is those households are paying more than 50% of their income to the rent. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit more about those low-income renters. About half of them are in the labor force, and generally speaking, that 49% is probably making the minimum wage, which in this state is still $7.25 an hour. About 19 or 20% are disabled, and so likely receiving Social Security disability income. And for those of us in the business, we know that those payments are around $750 to $800 a month. The housing wage in Salt Lake right now is $19.83 an hour. And obviously minimum wage isn't meeting that need, and neither is a fixed income of Social Security disability. Fair market rent right now in 2021 is $829 for a studio, around $1,000 for a 1-bed, and around $1,200 for a 2-bed. But we know that the prices are much, much higher than that on average. Next slide. So I'll just talk for a minute about the history of shared housing, particularly at the Road Home, and then we'll talk a little bit more about how we're rolling this out to the community. The Road Home has been experimenting with shared housing for a number of years. We have owned units in the community, and particularly with houses that we've owned, we have been matching roommates for a number of years without this new shared housing framework. Back in 2017, we started a Pay for Success program that is an enhanced rapid rehousing program for individuals who are experiencing what we call persistent homelessness. And that pilot project really had a heavy focus on shared housing. We had a goal of half of all of our participants being enrolled in a shared housing situation. And that turned out to be relatively successful. But we were so interested after these experiences that we applied for some funding in 2019 to deliver a pilot project. That funding came through Salt Lake City. And what we were able to do with that is to hire some staff to help us with this effort. And we had some funding that was directed towards helping folks move out into shared housing situations. We also were able to work with a consulting firm and develop some training modules around those basic tenets that we reviewed earlier. And then we developed a training that we could deliver to the community. And then again, in 2021, we received some additional funding. We worked again with a consultant to help us roll out this framework to the community. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. Before we move on, I just want to clarify that we don't, at the Road Home, we don't view shared housing as a program. It's an approach. So we consider shared housing something that we can talk about at every avenue. We want to have conversations at diversion before folks are admitted into shelter. We want to have those conversations ongoing as part of rapid resolution. And really, we've been able to place folks in shared housing situations using rapid rehousing and also using permanent supportive housing. So it ranges the gamut of our housing programs. Next slide. So with the Shared Housing Institute, and that was our consultant this year, we were able to roll out some community learning collaboratives. And we had 3 of them in the spring and the summer. And what we did was we brought the community together to talk about shared housing as an approach and to gauge interest in shared housing. And part of the work that we did was with the Shared Housing Institute, we developed very specific trainings for public housing authorities in our area. And that was around looking at HUD funding and what HUD funding could be used for shared housing. So this was good information for housing authorities, great information for partners. That training was officially rolled out, I believe, in September, October. And we now have this wealth of information and housing authorities that are trained to have these shared housing conversations at orientation, when folks receive vouchers and are ready to lease up. They can then think about whether or not they want to have a roommate. I should back up a little bit and say one thing that we did, which was really important to us before we rolled all of this out, was we did a survey in our emergency shelter several years ago to gauge the interest of shared housing of folks who were staying there. And it was interesting to us to see, we really thought we'd receive some pretty negative feedback about shared housing, but over half of our respondents indicated some serious interest in having a roommate, in sharing bills and sharing household chores. So that's how we decided really to move forward with this effort. So after the community learning collaboratives, we developed a shared housing task force, which is brand new in our community. I think we've met a total of 3 times now. And we're looking at community goals. That might be the next slide, Michelle. It is. So our initial goal was, of course, to create a shared housing task force, which we've done. And with the emphasis that it is time limited, we are committed to 12 months, and then we'll revisit at that point. We recognized that we needed to increase some of our community-wide trainings. So we are offering a basic shared housing training to partners in the community. We have some specific trainings on landlord engagement, and we can really dial it in on the specific tenets of shared housing and provide trainings to community partners. And then we did deliver those housing authority trainings, which was great. We also know that we need to develop some cohesive community messaging. So we need to really work across our sites in terms of how we talk to folks about shared housing, because it really does matter how it's presented to people, and it definitely does need to be presented as a choice, not as the only option. I think we've developed some interesting tools at the Road Home. For example, we have a budget template that looks at the cost burden that you would have as a single individual renting a unit versus what your cost might be if you were sharing with another person. And that seems to be a pretty effective way of talking about shared housing. So we are in the process of developing a flyer that partners can use, and really talking about the language that we're using when we speak to individuals about shared housing. We're working on our cross-agency communication and our data sharing. We have had some good conversations with our state HMIS team. We want to be able to measure this. So we are working on, at the point where we record exits, permanent exits in HMIS, we want to be able to tick a box that says whether or not it's a shared housing exit, because you'll see down in number 7, we have an ambitious goal of ensuring that 20% of our exits to permanent housing will be into shared housing, and we want to be able to measure that. Another thing that we've worked on, we are very cognizant that for survivors of DV, we need to take some extra steps and some extra considerations. So as a group, we have looked at some guidelines around shared housing and survivors of domestic violence. That's a document that we'd be happy to share if anyone's interested. We also wanted to make sure that when we were housing folks with different funding sources and different levels of support, that we have a shared understanding across the community of what the supportive service options might be for that household, depending on what level of financial support and case management support they're each receiving. So we're working through that. Next slide. Just to summarize the resources that we've been able to develop over the last few years to help roll this out, we do now have community trainings that we're able to deliver, including those housing authority trainings that I mentioned. We have multiple flyers. I have an example here on this slide. We do have that budget template that I was referencing earlier. We also have a shared housing resource guide, which is a pretty fantastic resource. It really is meant to help both the staff person and the client talk about shared housing. It runs through all the facets of shared housing. So, anything from securing an individual lease to conflict mediation and resolution. Also some advice about creating house rules and who to reach out to if you need some assistance. We talked about the shared housing considerations for survivors of DV, and then we talked a little bit about landlord cultivation. We have trainings and tools that are geared towards helping our partners in the community have those conversations with landlords that they are already working with, or how to secure new landlords and talk about shared housing. Okay, next slide. So what's next for us? We will, of course, continue to have our shared housing task force for the next 12 months. We'll work on those community goals. I think one conversation that we're starting to have right now is about cross-agency matching. So how do we pair somebody from a housing authority or from Volunteers of America with the road home? So we'll be looking into that and seeing about efficient and effective ways to do that. And then finally, we are very, very interested in creating more options for shared housing in our community. And I just have an example to the side there. This is from California, the Illumination Foundation. It's one of their units that they have just built for shared housing. There are a lot of models out there. Some of them are supportive of some pretty independent living. And then for some populations, for example, with our aging population, there might be more supportive services on site. But we are very, very interested in seeing an increase in shared housing in our community, whether that's in individual homes and units, or that's something that's purpose-built or renovated. So that's where we're headed next. I think that's my last slide.
Well, they gave you all of the data and I got to put all of that data to work. So first, thank you, Katie, for all of that good stuff, especially on the partnerships and how to use all that money. So we used all that money to build Riverwalk Village down in St. George. And this was our first private public partnership. The city of St. George donated the land, and then we used LIHTC and some public and private donations to then build this unit. It opened up in November of 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. And it's a 1, 2, 3, and 4 bedroom affordable housing complex that was very much needed. The most, I think, interesting thing about this project was how invested the city of St. George was in this project. And that to me is a really important factor when you're looking at in your own communities how to get these things done, is you have to have your city behind you, or your county, because it just doesn't pencil if you can't have, their support behind you. The thing that we really are proud of in Riverwalk is that we have really built a community within it. And we have a mixed use. So we do have some market rate in there, and then we have a bandwidth, so from 30% up to 55%. So there's a big mix in there, and nobody knows who's paying what rent. We have a community garden, and we've got community classes, we have movie nights, we've got paint nights, we've got a little sewing club going on. And so people are just feeling like they've got a real community within our Riverwalk Village. So it's one way to look at housing options and using monies that are available through a federal level and a state level to accomplish affordable housing. Next slide. This one is when we talk about innovative solutions. So this is a hotel that's down in St. George, and it'll open up here in the next couple of weeks. So it's a studio apartment. We obviously will change the name, so we won't keep it as a Studio 6 franchise. But in the concept of looking at how do you serve a specific population that has been kind of ostracized or kept out of a market. Michelle was talking earlier about really listening to the clients and figuring out what are they saying and why is it so hard, for them to get into housing. And what we were hearing, for the last 7 years is, man, I've got a criminal background, or I have substance use issues, and so no one will rent to me. And so this particular facility will be for those that are coming out of treatment, and they just haven't had a chance to get into a sober place and show that they have for 2 years. So it'll be a transitional housing for 2 years to help them establish a record and show that they've been a good tenant, and we can then roll them into something more permanent. And so there'll be a lot of support services featured around that. I think it's important to look at those populations that are falling through the gap. Each one of our communities has that, whether that say is a veteran housing or our population that is coming out of prison. We know that they are having a hard time because of background issues. And so how can we look within our communities and say, all right, let's take that special population and see if we can find a solution that helps them, because we know that it's such a struggle. Again, using some federal dollars. We saw on Katie's slide the great ARPA money, the rescue money. So we're going to partner. We partnered again with City of St. George and to use some CDBG money for this project, as well as some private donations. So again, it's all about trying to leverage as much as you can to make sure that you can keep the rent as low, deeply affordable as you can. And when I say deeply affordable, we're trying to keep that, any of those rents, on these particular projects with the hotels at that 450 or 500 mark and no higher, so that they have something left over. And like, Janice is saying, okay, on Social Security, somebody's making say $800. It just is impossible to cover everything else that you need if you are paying $700 a month in rent. Next slide. So the point, just like Michelle was talking about on how you're listening to your clients. And so when SwitchPoint was operating the winter overflow last year, all we heard over and over again, it was heartbreaking. Gosh, I wish I could stay here. I wish I could live here. And when we were working with Road Home with the Mill Creek overflow, we heard the same thing over and over again. And so we really had to listen and to scratch our heads and say, how do we make this possible? Because these were people who didn't want to be homeless, and they had some money, but they just could not afford. Looking at those slides again from Janice of saying, here's the rent in Salt Lake County. And there's no way with what they had in their pocket that they were going to be able to fit into those categories. And so this was a heavy lift to try and get done quickly. And to renovate it, to make it to where it was a studio. None of these rooms had a studio kitchen in them, so we had to put those in the summer. But it's important to be able to figure out in our communities what's available and can we make it possible, to fit into our budgets, right? So again, partnering with as many as we could. So the county of Salt Lake and the city of Salt Lake and the state and private donors. So knock on wood, everybody, and cross your fingers. Hopefully in 2 weeks, we're moving 137 people in. So this is important, and again, looking at that special population of seniors and those on disability, they have money. They just needed somewhere that was safe to be. I love it, that shared housing. That was a real eye opener this winter. Road Home was fantastic working with us when we had the clients in the Mill Creek winter overflow. And I can't even tell you, I was trying to pull that up, but we don't have access to the HIMIS anymore on that shelter of the homeless site, else I would have clicked on it to say, here's how many we matched up. But in our Mill Creek winter overflow, it was men only. And all of them were matching up to go, I'll be a roommate. I'll be a roommate. Hey, I like you. And they were self-matching up. And then Road Home would put them into shared housing. And it was quite remarkable how many took that option because it was so much easier for them to do that. And they did not want to go back on the street. So a great and flexible and innovative way to help people afford to get into housing options. So I guess the moral of the story is I think it's important for all of us as homeless providers to be as creative and aggressive is maybe the word I'm looking for today as possible. The number makes it to where I can't sleep at night, right? You're looking at just the Salt Lake County number that Janice was sharing. It's just a huge number, where if we're short 40,000 units, that's just a huge number. And every year that number gets bigger. So we have to get more aggressive on and finding solutions, else it's going to, implode the homeless system. We can't keep that many people in shelter. So I encourage everyone to just think outside that box. I love looking at all of the different options. There was some great topics yesterday about different options on how do we create other housing choices. So Next slide. So the next project, final project that we have going on right now is in Tooele County. And Tooele County, we partnered up with, again, it's all about partnering, right? So it's this is a 10-acre parcel that was on a old elementary school campus. So the school was built in 1950. And so we kept the name because it's so nostalgic, Harris Elementary. So it's the Harris Community Village Project. And again, we did a LIHTC project on it. It'll have 66 permanent supportive units on it of 1 and 2 bedrooms. And then and those will be new construction, but the school building itself will be renovated, and we will use that as our community resource center. So in the community resource center, because again, we're listening to the clients and the gap in the community, we will have not only the emergency shelter, but we'll move our pantry over there. We'll have a soup kitchen in there, and we'll move in our 24/7 childcare center in there so that those families have the ability to go to work and their kids could be in there. So we're trying to make sure that, again, we listen and we hopefully can fill the gaps with the space that we have. And then we're creating some stability and some housing for those clients. So those are the projects that we've got going on. That's it.
Well, thanks, everyone. That was such great information and so exciting to hear all the good work that's happening. I think we know, and we know in Salt Lake County specifically, the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness, our goal is to reduce the number of shelter beds because there's enough affordable housing and support that we don't need as many shelter beds. Unfortunately, we're not at that point. And, housing is harder than it ever was before. And so it's exciting to hear these new initiatives and new projects that are coming online and new partners at the table. Mary, how are we going to do the Q&A? Let's see.
So we're going to read you the questions that have come up. There have been a couple that Janice has already answered, but we'll just reread them so that people who kind of didn't get a chance to see them will have the opportunity to. Give me just 1 second and we'll get started. Janice has already answered this one, but I'm just going to share it with the group. The first question is in regard to shared housing and landlords and separate leases. Are you finding landlords not willing to enter into separate leases? If the person has a housing choice voucher, the HAP contract requires they have separate leases. If you do see this, what suggestions do you have to help get landlords to accept separate leases in shared housing situations? Do you want to expand on your answer, Janice, or tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, at this point, we haven't really struggled with landlords who have been unwilling to sign separate leases. We do also need separate leases for our funding sources, so we've been able to negotiate that pretty well so far. So I don't really have good advice if you run into that problem, because we've been able to work through that.
Perfect. And then Janice, you're actually typing this one out right now, but the question states, could master lease units with the MH agencies be staffed for shared housing if property management approves?
Yeah, you'll want to check the regs on the funding source for that housing program, but we're able to do that with our master lease program.
Wonderful. The next question I'm going to combine with the question after it, which is, Carol, people are curious about how to get someone into the point and if there is still availability for that project, what the referral process looks like, that kind of information.
Yeah, and as of yesterday, we had 12 spots left. If they want to, I can type in an email to see. Let me just put in, I'm going to put my email in there, and then I'll see if whoever emails me back, I'll put in the referral form. I can't read without my glasses on, but we'll see how many come in today. But we'll certainly do a waiting list too.
Perfect. And then someone asked, I was not aware that Section 8 will accommodate shared housing. How does that work?
Say that question again, Zach, sorry.
Oh, you're good. So it says, I was not aware that Section 8 will accommodate shared housing. How does that work?
It does. And I think as long as your housing authority is trained in how to implement that, it's a pretty simple process. I don't know all the ins and outs because we're not a housing authority, but yeah, it absolutely supports shared housing.
Wonderful.
There's a different way to calculate the rents, is my understanding, because there's more than one person in the unit. But yeah, it's a fairly simple process.
Thank you very much. Would it be possible to put the emails that you had at the end of the slideshow back up for everyone?
I'll try.
And then there's one last question. How does Medicaid eligibility fit into making resources available to residents? If so, how are you finding the navigation process to get folks enrolled?
I might need some clarification. What resources are we talking about with Medicaid?
Margaret, if you'd like, I can make it possible for you to speak if you'd like to provide us a little bit more information. Margaret, you should be unmuted, or you should be able to unmute if you'd like to kind of provide a little more information.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, all the things that Medicaid is usually provides, the medical, all of the surround services. And in addition, Medicaid under the new resources, they're capable of helping people to pay for moving, for all kinds of things that make it possible for them to be successful in maintaining housing. And this has come about, I've been listening to the webinars. This has come about because the Biden people have said to Medicaid, loosen your benefits so that we can keep people housed, not have them fall out. There's been several webinars on this. I'm sure I'm not the only person who's been listening.
Yeah, no, that's really a really great question, Margaret. As we know, the benefits for Medicaid vary state by state. And also we have several different Medicaid programs within our state, some for families, several now for individuals under the expansion. So we need to do a little more research to figure out which particular Medicaid provides the resources that you're talking about. But in terms of getting enrolled, most of us, at least partner agencies in Salt Lake County, are able to connect with DWS to help our folks get enrolled. In fact, we have eligibility workers that come on site to our resource centers and our housing facilities to help with that enrollment process, which has been hugely beneficial for the folks that we're serving. But as Medicaid is an ever-changing landscape, we probably need some new information about the services that you're referring to.
Thank you very much for that. Another question is, how do we get housing authorities to recognize shared housing with Section 8 vouchers?
Well, I think the first step is probably to engage in some training. And you can reach out to the Shared Housing Institute. They've developed a very nice package training for housing authorities. Ours was recently delivered and it was, I believe, a 2-day training. Very thorough, very comprehensive. So I'd start there.
All right, and then there is time for one more question. So it says, I am not sure if you can speak to this, but do you have thoughts on the concept of tiny home communities as a means of creating housing for those experiencing homelessness?
I feel like I've been talking a lot, so if somebody else wants to take it.
I think it's a fantastic idea, and I would love to do one in Washington County, because what's already going to happen in Salt Lake County. I think it's a really good, unique idea for those that need an independent space. It works really well in Austin. It works really well in Santa Barbara. It's worked really well in Texas. So tiny home communities that can give an independence but leave people to have their own space. I think it's important.
I agree with you, Carol. And I just want to add to that, that if we want to be serving the most vulnerable, that any housing, tiny home or not, we really need to focus on low barriers and on housing first in order to make that work for the folks that we're serving.
I'll also add that we're seeing a wide range of what people consider a tiny home, anything from a garden shed or just really just a box, a wooden box without insulation or heat or electricity, to something that actually looks like a house. And so I think it's really important to talk about housing as being true housing, and it can be very small housing and very efficient housing. And so if you create a tiny house model, be sure that it is truly housing. And again, the idea of creating a community is even better. And so there are some very innovative ways that communities in Hawaii, and as you mentioned, also in Austin, that have created small, efficient homes that are truly homes for people, and then they create a sense of community. And that is a great opportunity. I think it's also important to note that it's not going to be cheaper if you create tiny homes versus regular size units. It's not going to be less expensive, but some people really do like the model, and I would just encourage it to be truly housing. Though there are tiny homes that are more of the garden shed variety that people are using as very temporary shelter to get folks out of encampments and transition them on to other housing, and that is an option, but that's really just a sheltering and a very temporary option.
I think that's a great question to circle back to the beginning of where we started in this presentation about how it's important to listen to the people we're serving about what they need and to have a variety of types of housing. And so we're excited to have a new type of housing in Salt Lake. We're excited to see what happens with the tiny home village that's in the works here. I think one additional thing I would add with different types of housing coming online is that collaborative piece that we've all talked about, and how important it is for us to work together and work on a system level and make sure we're looking at the impacts on the system and the outcomes of each of the programs that come online, and we're incorporating those best practices. I know we have come a long way in Salt Lake with the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness. We're excited to keep going in that direction where we're able to pull together and really continue to grow and have a more sophisticated coordinated entry system so that all these different types of housing can be at the table for the people who are experiencing homelessness, and they can see what those options are and choose the one that's going to work best for them. And it's great to have lots of different variety at the table there. And so any closing thoughts from any of the panelists? Well, I just want to thank you all. This was such a great session. It was so wonderful to hear from all three of you. Thank you, participants, for your questions. Again, our contact information is there on the screen. I think we're all happy to follow up with any questions afterwards, and have a great rest of the conference.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.